Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. So yeah, I work on collective animal behavior. And ever since I was a kid, I was fascinated by the types of patterns I'm showing you here. Here are schooling fish and flocking birds. And what might be surprising to you is that despite the ubiquity of these types of patterns, we still have only a very rudimentary understanding of both how and why animals like this coordinate behavior. And yet collective behavior is not just about animal behavior, it also tells us something about ourselves. If you cut yourself, your cells have to get into collective action to heal that wound before infection sets in. So these are the types of dynamics that we see around us and also within us. And we're all familiar with collective behavior. We ourselves are within a collective, our own society, as you can see from the patterns here. And I'll return to this study at the end, where we've been developing software to track not just the positions of people in crowds, but also how they're socially influencing each other to investigate socially contagious behaviors. But I want to start off with some work. I'm going to sort of progress more and more towards network-related studies. But of course, as the introduction pointed out, one can view all of these systems as some complex interacting network. So does anyone know what these creatures are? I heard it already. These are locusts. Again, something we're very familiar with, a biblical plague. These locusts have a huge impact on the livelihood of people. I do my field research in Mauritania, in West Africa, and I'm showing you the distribution of one species, the desert locust. The desert locust can invade up to 1/5 of the Earth's land surface during plague years. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN estimate that they influence the livelihood of 1 in 10 people on the planet. It's hard to think of a greater impact than that. And yet, in Science magazine, it was admitted quite correctly that even after 50 years of fighting locusts, it's more of an art than a science. And this is remarkable because the individual locust is one of the best studied organisms for physiology and neuroscience, especially in Europe. But why do these locusts swarm? We don't know, or we didn't know. So there are these big questions out there that we want to try to address. And in actual fact, locusts don't grow wings until the last stage of their life. It's a dispersal phase. Here's some time-lapse footage of them hatching out in my lab. And you can see these little, what are called hoppers, or nymphs, don't have wings, and yet they march together. And it's now thought that these hopper bands are the critical phase for locust control. And so what we've done is these are not the smartest animals out there. We've put them in this annulus arena where they march around in this, what they think is a never-ending desert environment. And then I've developed software to track the motion of all of the individuals simultaneously for 8 hours a day, so we can really get at how these locusts are interacting with each other. And I'm going to just summarize some of the things we've found. Well, if you look at 1 is the locusts going clockwise, -1 are the locusts going anti-clockwise, and I'm increasing the density of locusts here. You can see at low densities, it's a bit of a mess. They're a bit like particles in a gas. They're bumping into each other, but there's no real structure to the motion. As we increase it, we get an intermittent phase where they march counterclockwise, then clockwise, then counterclockwise, and you can see these very sudden transitions between them. And finally, at a sufficiently high density for the entire 8 hours, in this particular experiment, they marched clockwise. And when we were doing these experiments, we were interested in relating these to models of magnetic systems. And so we could explain how locally aligned individuals could lead to these large-scale structures and these types of intermittent behaviors. But it didn't tell us why the locusts were coordinating their behavior. And in actual fact, in our paper in Science, we sort of get the story wrong. And that's often the case because we're thinking about, well, maybe they're helping each other out. Maybe individuals detecting food on one side of the group can transmit information across the group. And what we discovered really quite by chance was, well, I had a postdoc, Jerome, who's at least one person in the room knows. And Jerome was a passive-aggressive Frenchman, let's face it. He always wore black, and he would come in, and he would get angry with me in a very quiet way about me not counting the locusts correctly, putting the wrong number in. And I was sure I was putting the right number in. I was double, triple checking, and they couldn't possibly be escaping. And so going back to the video, I saw that the locusts would be chewing on each other and causing damage, and sometimes completely eating each other. So we found something that we weren't necessarily looking for. And so with Sepide Bazazi, an undergraduate in my lab, we cut the nerves that give locusts the sensation of biting to the abdomen. And if we make swarms of these nerve-cut individuals, shown in red, they wouldn't swarm. So if the locust can't feel the biting from behind, they don't march. And they're, in fact, statistically indistinguishable from insects that are not interacting at all. But locusts have a pretty good visual system as well. So we wanted to ask, well, what role does that play in swarm formation? And so at the top here, you see a normal locust. In the second picture in B, this is a really high-tech experiment. We've used model paint to paint the front half of the locust's eye to prevent information from the front. In C, we're painting the back of the eye to prevent information coming from behind. And the last poor locust is completely blinded. And if we put swarms together, I want you to look at the orange and the green points particularly. The orange point represents a swarm where everybody is blind. And as you can imagine, they don't swarm. But the green point beside it, which again is statistically the same, is the case where you cannot see, the back part of the eye is painted black, you cannot see approaching individuals from the rearward side. So if you cannot see individuals approaching you, and you cannot feel individuals biting you, then you don't swarm. So in actual fact, we have a sort of a new mechanism for collective motion. And so I wanted to go and test this idea in the natural world. So I went to Mauritania, as I showed you before, and we crossed the desert for about 2.5 days. And remarkably, it's kind of difficult to find locusts. The swarm in the end was 17 kilometers in perimeter. So we did find it. And this is me filming the locusts, and you can see in the background footprints, locust footprints in the sand. And here's our camel, and that's Abdallahi Al-Baba, who's the head of the Locust Commission in Mauritania. And this is our camel. It's not often we do field research with such cool creatures, so I thought I'd show you a picture of that. But it turns out that I'm not very good at doing field work. I hadn't sort of put two and two together, locust plague equals famine. And so we ran out of food. It was a terrible trip. And the only food we could get was this. These are camel entrails, which we hung in a tree to dry in the sun like a jerky. You can see a fly down at the bottom there laying its eggs. And I'd been vegetarian for a decade, and so I became exceptionally sick. They really did think I was going to die. I thought I was going to die. You can see the quality of my preparation by my $50 tent here. Those are my Mauritanian colleagues' tents, and as resourceful biologists, we also use the tree to dry our clothing. But what you see in the background there is a sandstorm moving towards us. My tent actually stayed up, and my Mauritanian colleagues were all sleeping on top of their tent the following morning. And this is not a sandstorm, this is the sandstorm that I just showed you, that I took from NASA's website. And it literally blew the locusts away. I was in Mauritania for 2.5 months. I got 20 minutes worth of video, and I've been too traumatized ever to look at it. It was a disaster. So we decided to repeat the experiment in the good old US of A, where you have things like roads. You don't have locusts, at least not locusts of the swarming variety. They were made extinct, I guess, about 100 years ago. But here you can see a Mormon cricket chowing down on one of its buddies and dragging it along underneath it. It has to climb up something to escape the horde. So again, these apparently vegetarian insects, we'd find they'd eat roadkill, they'd eat the ears off this bunny, You can see them crawling in through the eye and in through the mouth. And they'd eat each other. And so we created experiments with artificial diets. P stands for protein, C for carbohydrate, and the O is just a neutral diet with no nutritional value. Now, you would expect vegetarian insects to love carbohydrate, but they don't care about it one little bit. But protein, add a bit of protein to the carbohydrate, now we're talking. Now it's pretty tasty, but not nearly as tasty as a pure protein diet. They actually taste it with their feet. And I'm going to show you a living histogram. Of course, I randomized this when I did these experiments. But now we're looking at salt concentration from just pure water to very strong 2 molar salt concentration. And you can see them fighting over 0.25 molar, which is represented in the figure on the right as well. And so what's so special about that concentration? Well, it turns out to be the concentration of cricket blood. So these organisms are finely tuned to a cannibalistic lifestyle. And we have a new mechanism for collective motion that we call a forced march, where individuals are trying to prevent themselves from being attacked, but yet attacking those ahead and stop, and you risk being cannibalized. And this has allowed us to then return to computational models where we can simulate these interactions to show how we get this autocatalytic onset of collective motion driven by nutritional dependencies. And we can use GPU coding to simulate vast swarms of insects. Because as I told you earlier on, we're looking at this very microscopic scale at the moment, discovering these new things about how and why locusts swarm. But as you can see, I took this from the web just a short while ago, and swarms are just beginning to build up. This could be a particularly bad year. And this isn't bad at the moment, but you can see the vast area, and also areas like Mali, areas that it's very difficult to go into and very difficult to control. So what we need to do, this is, again, I've just taken it online. This is the areas that are currently being watched for locust plagues. I mean, it's a vast area, but because these are poor countries, there's virtually no research into this. So we really need to move beyond this microscopic description to start making testable predictions in the field and eventually try to understand how we can combine climate models and other types of frameworks to explore locust behavior. Now, not all animals in collectives are trying to eat each other, thankfully. And if we look at schooling fish like this, well, here we can start thinking about information processing. And I'm lucky to work with the BBC, who put these very beautiful graphics on my simulation. And as a biologist, I want to try and get inside the head of these individuals. And so one way we can do this, certainly when I started this research, it wasn't that there was a dearth of data, there was no data. And so we started off developing computational models where we can hypothesize the types of interactions, local interactions, among individuals in groups. And so we can represent individuals existing at certain positions, centroids, which is the C, and with certain velocities. We can represent, for example, the tendency, if you get too close to your neighbors, to want to avoid them, to turn away from other individuals to avoid collisions. If you're too far away, then we can simulate attraction, biosocial attraction, which is what brings individuals together. It's dangerous to be isolated. And so the first part of this equation represents that tendency to be attracted. But as you've seen in those movies, there's also potentially a tendency to align your velocity vectors, to want to move in the same direction as near neighbors. And so the human brain is not very good at working out, okay, what would happen if I change these parameters? How does it scale to collective dynamics? So here we see a 3D model. The arrow represents the direction of travel of the individual. The ZOR is that zone of repulsion. The ZOA, which is the outer zone, is the zone of attraction. And I found that the ZOO, the zone of orientation, this tendency to align, changing the size of that zone had a very profound impact. And many of the other properties didn't matter. It didn't matter whether these were discrete zones, whether these were continuous functions. As long as you have this general framework, the model is extremely robust. The predictions of the model are extremely robust. They predict that if you don't have this tendency to align, if you just have repulsion and long-range attraction, We get a mosquito-like swarm, as you see here, where there's disorder within the group. As we introduce that tendency to align with your near neighbors, we get a sudden transition into a rotating state, a sort of torus formation, where individuals perpetually rotate around an empty core. But of course, there's nothing in the equations of motion that said go in a circle. And for exactly the same behaviors, we also see a different pattern. We see what we will typically think of as a fluid moving group. And I'm going to return to this model later on. So I want you to remember the predictions of this model, which are these three fundamental sort of states of matter of these types of groups. And so again, what I'm really fascinated about is, can we think of animal groups as being some sort of collective mind? Can there be some sort of collective memory or collective intelligence that emerges from these types of interactions, or collective cognition? And so to start looking at that, I wanted to investigate leadership and decision-making and ask, how do grouping animals make informed, unanimous decisions? And so these organisms have memory. As was said in the introduction, these are not your simple particles of physics. We can take lots of ideas and clues from statistical mechanics, but we also have to modify these frameworks. So an individual here has goal-oriented behavior represented by that red arrow. It perhaps remembers that there's food over there. So it has a tendency to want to stick with the others, but also go off in that direction. Does it need to signal to others? I know what's going on. Follow me. Do others need to recognize that that individual is informed? And furthermore, do animals like this even have that capacity? And would that be evolutionarily viable? Well, there's no evidence for this in these types of groups. And if we take a very simple model, in this case a two-dimensional model, so we always try to go to the simplest model that can explain the phenomena of interest. Well, individuals, as I said before, have a social tendency, a sort of schooling or flocking tendency, but informed individuals have to reconcile that with this goal-oriented behavior. Now, it's going to be important for you to know that when I show you color, like I've colored this individual in bright red, that is so we can see who has information. In the model, there's no cheating going on. They start at random positions, random orientations, and there's no way to infer the status of other individuals. We've also looked at things like signaling, but in this version of the model, we have the simplest assumptions. And so individuals that have information need to reconcile a social tendency, S, with their goal-oriented behavior. And we assume they do so with a weighting term called omega. If omega is very small, as shown here, then they largely group with others. But if individuals get really hungry or very strongly opinionated, then they have a larger bias towards their preferred direction, which of course can lead them to leaving the group at extreme values. And so I'll just show you some simulations. So these leaders want to go in a common preferred direction for now, and I'm going to show you 1, 5, and 10 informed individuals within a group of 100. And the green cross just shows you the center of gravity of the group. And you can see one individual is not having much luck. 5, however, after an initial period of reorganization and restructuring, whereby they occupy the front of the group, will tend to start moving together. And 10 informed individuals, suddenly and near spontaneously, they will move in the correct direction. And so we can then quantify the accuracy between 0, which is completely random motion, and 1, which is perfect taxis in that direction. And I should have mentioned this is a stochastic model. But look at these different lines. They represent different group sizes. And if we take a group size, let's take an arbitrary accuracy, say 85% accuracy. And if we look at the darker line, the smallest group size, for that level of accuracy, well, we need around half of the individuals to have information. However, if we go to the largest group we looked at, 200 individuals, for the same level of accuracy, now we need less than 5% of the individuals to have information. So as group size gets larger, the proportion of informed individuals you need to guide the group gets much, much smaller. And this has given us lots of clues about how to understand and to model both animal migration and also cellular migration. This is a brain tumor here where you can see those leader cells guiding others through the tissue. The red there is a marker for podoplannin, which allows them to push through the surrounding tissue. But I don't have time to talk about everything today, so I do want to talk about another aspect. So far, all of my leaders have been in agreement with each other. But of course, we're familiar with the fact that groups and aggregates can be in disagreement. So can we also investigate that property? So what about if there are other individuals that disagree about where to go? Can they come to a collective consensus? If we were deciding, right, let's all go to the same bar tonight, and I ask you, like, which one should we go to? And 6 of you want to go to one bar, and 5 want to go to the other, and the rest of you don't really know Chicago. Then how would we do it? I would do the calculation, and then I would pass back the answer to you. Very hierarchically organized way of doing it. Well, here there's an equal number wanting to get to the white and the red targets, and 50-50, they will choose one of those targets. But if we add just more one white individual to this group, again, the colors are purely for our benefit, then over 99% of the time, the group correctly computes the majority direction. And you can sort of see the noisy nature of the interactions in these simulations. So they're very capable of computing through the kinematics of motion. They don't need to count. They effectively vote. But if omega is very large, if you're really unwilling to give up on your opinions, well, then the group can fail to achieve consensus, and groups can tend to split. And of course, the uninformed individuals shown in green can then learn about their environment. So this got me thinking about, well, they seem to be voting. And we've got lots of evidence in the literature that animals are capable of doing this, and this now helps us understand this. But we also have to come to consensus decisions within our own society. And there's often conflicting interests. In fact, our democracy is called an adversarial democracy because of this. But failing to achieve a consensus, if you're on a committee, say a faculty committee, and you fail to agree, therefore you don't hire anybody, this is very costly. So, as in animal groups, failure to achieve consensus is costly, but individuals may be susceptible to a strongly opinionated or an extremist minority. And the question we want to ask is, are those who are uninformed, who have weak preferences, are they susceptible to being manipulated by this extremist or strongly opinionated minority? And there tends to be, in the social sciences at least, this sort of thought that extremism can percolate through societies because of uninformedness. I cannot find any data to support that, so I'd be very interested if anyone has data. And of course, in human societies, in many different, independently, many different times, voting has emerged. Well, what does voting allow? It means that it doesn't matter how strongly I believe in something, I still have the same opinions as you, and as you. But what about animal or cellular groups? Well, they've got a limited means of conveying a vote, no global overview of voting, and only relatively local interactions, and no explicit capacity to count. So does the concept of fair representation hold within animals? So I told you, and I showed you before, that if we have a majority versus a minority, the majority will tend to dominate. And they'll come to consensus. But then you may ask, well, why doesn't the minority just increase their intransigence? Increase their unwillingness to give up on the direction that they want to go? Does that work? So here I'm going to show you a model with 6 versus 5, where everybody has a preference. And the majority has a preference of 0.3, and if the minority also has a preference of 0.3, the majority will tend to win, of course. But as the minority increases their intransigence, their unwillingness to give up, then you can see that they begin to and then completely dominate group decisions. 1 is the majority winning 100% of the time, 0 is the minority winning 100% of the time, and 0.5 is half of the time one group wins, and half of the time the other group wins. And so it seems that being opinionated is a good strategy. But what about if we have uninformed individuals, or individuals without strong preferences within the group? Often, information is costly to acquire or difficult to acquire. So there's typically information heterogeneity. Well, now everything changes. So here we have the minority having a stronger preference than the majority, but not so strong. In fact, the majority is still winning around 60% of the time when there are no uninformed individuals. But then as I start adding stupid individuals into the group, or uninformed individuals, you can see it pushes it back to majority control before then saturating out at random decisions. And I can increase the minority's preference to make them stronger and stronger. Now, without uninformed individuals, the minority will win almost all of the time. But adding in then individuals that don't have strong preferences spontaneously flips control back to the majority. So you may think, well, that's kind of interesting. That maybe tells us something about why we don't have extremist views in animal groups, because it's not a very stable strategy. But have we uncovered something that's perhaps a bit more generic that can relate to other systems? So we also wanted to ask this because there are so many systems where individuals influence and are influenced by others. There are technological systems, there are neuronal systems, and of course there's our own human society. And so this is where the networks really became very explicit. We wanted to take two different types of models, one which is like the Voter model in statistical physics, and one which is a convention model which is used in the social sciences, and explore these properties with these modifications. And these are deliberately simplified models, but they do allow us to get access to these dynamics. This paper was just published in December, and so we're looking at much more sophisticated models at the moment. But I'll just take you through the general philosophy of how we've been doing this with an adaptive network model. And this really has been a wonderful collaboration with Thilo Gross and Gerwin Demirel. And so I don't really need to say too much about networks to an audience like this. Now we can represent individuals in an abstract way as nodes. And then edges can represent the interactions between the organisms. And so there are key features of the model. Individuals adopt probabilistically the opinion they perceive to be in the local majority. And the strength of individual preferences is manifested as intransigence and unwillingness to give up on your opinions, or you'll flip back to your previous opinion even if you were changed. And there's one key factor, mathematically one key factor, that does need to be in this model to get the results I'll show you, which is that if I interact with you, you have a small probability of changing my opinion if you disagree with me, and vice versa. But if I interact with you, and you both disagree with me, I've got a greater than 2 times the probability. There's a synergistic effect. And all of the other details, whether it's small world, scale free, all that stuff doesn't matter in terms of the basic features that I'm going to show you. So using a similar plot as before, we can see that as the number of uninformed individuals is shown on the x-axis, if the majority and minority have the same preference strength, the majority wins. If I increase the minority preference, they can dominate decision-making. If I add uninformed individuals, well, initially, nothing changes. The minority still wins. But then there's a tipping point where suddenly adding just a few more, or changing the proportion, actually, we're not adding, we're changing the proportion of nodes, just changing to add a few more uninformed nodes completely changes the system dynamics. And now the majority wins. And we can then create an analytical approximation. So this was a simulation with 10,000 nodes. We can create an analytical approximation using moment expansion and moment closure techniques to explore the nature of the bifurcation. And so we see that below a critical density of uninformed nodes, the only stable state for these equations is for the minority to win. But then we see, as we increase the uninformed density, we see the appearance of a subtle node bifurcation, and then a stable majority and an unstable, undecided state. And the blue circles just represent simulations, and the solid lines represent an analytical solution. The nice thing about, of course, the analytical model is we can then explore the key properties across phase space. So on the x-axis, we have the relative strength of minority preference versus the numerical advantage of the majority. And so you can see in gray the area that the majority is sufficiently numerous that they can win, and in black the area that the minority can dominate decision-making. But here everybody has information, or everybody has preferences. But if we add uninformed individuals to the population, I'm going to show you the region that goes from minority and flips to majority control in white. And so you can see now that the minority can only control in this very thin sliver of phase space. So the strategy of just increasing the strength of your opinions is no longer viable above a critical density of uninformed nodes within the network. So we make no judgment regarding the value of these views. We're just exploring the dynamics. But we do conjecture that this phenomenon may be widespread. We're finding this in models of neural dynamics. We're finding this in other types of models of statistical physics. So it's, we've got a long way to go, but we think that the fact that we've seen this pattern in these different models is very promising. Furthermore, we make a testable prediction, and I'm a biologist. I want to go out there and test these ideas. Uninformed individuals should inhibit the influence of an opinionated minority and return control to the majority. And in fact, the theory predicts that this should happen in our swarming models with a very small number of uninformed individuals. Therefore, it's experimentally tractable. So we turn to a funny organism, perhaps you may think, but these schooling fish. And we can train these individuals to have preferences for a blue target or a yellow target, and we can change the strength of these preferences in a variety of ways, and then just release them and see where they go. And what we found is if there are no uninformed individuals, then a more opinionated minority will tend to win. But as we add 5 and then 10 naive individuals, so just as predicted by our theory, we've flipped control back to the majority. So uninformed individuals inhibit extremism and promote democratic consensus decision-making. Now, I want you to think back to the model I showed you at the beginning of the fish schooling section. That model that made the prediction that we have these 3 fundamental states. Well, when I came to Princeton, I wanted to move beyond modeling. I wanted to get data. And as I said, there was no data available before. And so we've developed software that can track the motion of hundreds of individuals simultaneously to explore in detail the dynamics. We can get as detailed data from our real system as we could from simulations only a few years ago. And in over 100 hours worth of filming, we have only ever seen the 3 states as predicted by our theory. And you can see these 3 states here. This is the degree of rotation of the group and the degree of polarization. And so the system basically flips between these different states. This is showing the density distribution of a very, very, very long time series. But it's kind of cool because we can then ask, one of the things we wanted to ask is what drives these different dynamics? Are the individuals changing behavior to change states? Or do we have a metastable regime whereby we have 2 dynamically stable states for identical individual behaviors? Well, what we find is that the swarm state, which is low rotation and low polarization, is associated with slow speed. But the 2 locally ordered states, the torus and the parallel state, are both associated with high speed. And if we look in detail at the different group sizes and the local dynamics, the global dynamics are very different between the polarized state and the torus state. But the local dynamics are identical. So the fish don't know that they're in one state or the other. They're in a metastable regime that's stochastically flipping between those 2 different attractors. And then we can return to our model, because we didn't modify speed in the original model. But going back to that simplistic sort of canonical model, we show that we get the same dynamics. And we're very interested in understanding social influencing groups. So here, the red individuals, these are real data. These are not simulations. The red individuals are the informed individuals, and the blue individuals are uninformed individuals. And we're testing all sorts of ideas, such as we've been able to show that as we increase the number of uninformed individuals, as predicted by the theory, we can change the grouping dynamics. We're also looking at the socially contagious behavior of the waves. We're looking at this in a sort of percolation epidemic type framework, where the state that's changing is a behavioral state, as I said, we can track the individuals to get their positions and their orientations. But we can do better than that. We can also calculate automatically in real time the positions of their eyes and use a raycasting algorithm to reconstruct what they're actually seeing. Because social networks in animal behavior have typically been based on simple proximity. But animals are actually using, in our case, we're lucky, they use just predominantly vision to coordinate their behavior. So we can now track, we're also tracking the motion of the bodies and the curvature of the bodies, but we can reconstruct the visual field of each individual in the group. And so it allows us to move away from this simple proxy of localization, which we think is very important to move away from that, and actually construct what you're seeing here, a sensory network. This is based on the visual information on the retina of that individual, of each individual. And we can look at lots of things like the lume, the rate of angular change on the retina, and really build up hypotheses, predictions. And we have really a ridiculously large amount of data. For anyone out there who would like to collaborate with us, we're looking for collaborators on this particular project. Well, why are we interested in how information flows through these groups? Well, because we really, frankly, have got no idea how these distributed systems, such as bird flocks and fish schools, can act almost as one in this near-synchronous fashion. There's something special about it. Our models do not capture correctly the rate of information transfer. And so, our models can produce pretty pictures like this. But if we actually go in and ask, how good are these models? They're really not very good yet. They can explore broadly, they can explain broadly the types of patterns we see, but certainly not the details of the interactions. We've also developed RoboPredator, which is a Bluetooth-controlled robot that we can use to attack groups to create these controlled perturbations. We've developed acoustic imaging techniques that allow us to go into the natural environment. This is in Louisiana, in the Gulf, where we can track predators hunting prey schools and actually quantify the information flow across these groups. This paper just came out last week, where we show that, well, Lewis won't like this, but there's a scale-free nature to the types of dynamics here. But we can also look at the proxy for risk. And we can show that really these predators hunt in groups too. The predators need to use collective behavior to handle the information transfer of prey. And so we can really quantify that under natural conditions. So there's lots of data for people interested in this type of topic. And the last thing I want to tell you about is an unpublished work that, again, where the social interactions are really critical. There's a great reason to know, to understand how do cells, how do animals detect complex environments? How do they move through complex environments? Whether they're chemical environments or whether they're nutritional landscapes. We don't know. The general idea is that each individual makes a local noisy estimate, and then perhaps by grouping with others, they can somehow pool these noisy estimates. It's called the many wrongs hypothesis. But no one's ever tested it. So we decided to go out and do that. So here's fish in the lab. In the top, you're showing fish in a light gradient. Below, you're seeing exactly the same scene, but we filmed it in infrared light, so we can track the fish, and then we superimpose the light gradient. And the fish, for safety, they like to be in the dark regions. So they will tend to track these dark regions. And we can then track the fish and ask, is the current theory correct? And what we find is, yes, as group size increases, the groups become much better able to actually sense their environment and detect their environment. But we find no evidence that each individual can detect the light gradient. So if the individuals can't detect the light gradient, how on earth is the group able to do so? So we're moving away from this idea of individuals just pooling, everyone making an imperfect estimate and pooling knowledge. There's another way of doing it, which is true emergent, where the problem is solved through the network of interactions. And it's very, very simple. What the fish are actually doing is simpler than we could possibly imagine. They're simply modifying their speed according to a scalar measure of the local light level. They move more slowly in dark regions and faster in light regions. And so if you consider these fish to be in a gradient, and they have an environmental stimulus, i.e. the direction of that gradient, versus their social stimulus, And then we looked to see what was their actual acceleration. How well did it correlate with those two hypotheses for how the organism may move in this environment? Well, you can see here that the social vector completely dominates the environmental vector. They're solving it through social interactions. And grouping facilitates an awareness of the environment that individuals don't have. Individuals in the dark region will tend to slow down, and this causes the sort of spring-like interactions to create a sort of slingshot mechanism that swings the whole group around. And so we can show in a simulation model, here's the experiment, of course, but we can show in a simulation model that individuals don't need to detect the gradient at all. We can just use the speed-dependent modulation. And this is important because it's now allowing us to make these very small robots that don't need to know the gradient they're in. They just need to make a scalar local measure. We're also looking at tensegrity structures, such as how cells climb gradients. If each cell just modifies its actin filaments locally based upon chemicals it detects, then across the cell structure, this type of mechanism allows the cell to chemotax. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but this has been published a few weeks ago in PNAS. We've also been looking at socially contagious behavior. We've been doing manipulative experiments. We've been putting actors in crowds to actually subtly manipulate gaze-copying behavior. And this is challenging. I mean, we've basically shown also by reanalyzing Milgram's work from the late 1960s that people have misinterpreted his gaze-copying behavior for 4 decades. It's not evidence for a quorum-type response. It's not going to lead to crystallization of behaviors in crowds or tipping points. And we've also been able to show that information within crowds flows backwards. You'll tend to copy the back of people's heads. You'll actually be inhibited by face-to-face interactions. And yet all gaze-copying research in psychology has involved face-to-face interactions within a laboratory. But if you actually go to the field, you see that individuals are getting cues from those ahead who are moving in the same direction as themselves, presumably because that gives you valid information for the environment that you're going to shortly experience. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I'll take any questions.